My son-in-law shoved me down the stairs and broke my back. My daughter told the police it was an accident. But when I couldn't move from that hospital bed, I made one phone call that changed everything. By the time Luke walked free from that courtroom smirk on his face, I already had the evidence that would send him to prison. And my daughter? She had no idea what was coming. You won't believe what happened next. It started with shouting that shook the walls of my own house. Luke was screaming at Clara again, his voice full of poison I'd heard too many times before. I'd stayed quiet for months, biting my tongue while he tore her down piece by piece. But that night, something in me snapped. I walked into their bedroom and told him to stop. He turned toward me, eyes wild with rage. Then he shoved me hard, both hands against my chest. I stumbled backward toward the staircase. My foot caught air where it should have been. The corner of the banister caught my spine, and I heard something crack deep inside my body before the pain even registered. Clara screamed my name, but it sounded far away, like I was underwater. I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond no matter how hard I tried. The pain in my back felt like fire spreading through every nerve. Clara knelt beside me, tears streaming down her face, but she wouldn't look at me directly. Luke stood at the top of the stairs, breathing hard, staring down at what he'd done. When Mrs. Patterson from next door knocked frantically asking what happened, I heard Clara's voice shake as she answered through the crack in the door. She said I tripped. Said I lost my balance because I'm old and my eyes aren't what they used to be. Mrs. Patterson offered to call an ambulance, and Clara finally agreed. As I lay there on the cold floor waiting for help, I realized something terrible. The accident wasn't the fall. The accident was ever trusting them. The paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher while Luke hovered nearby, playing the concerned son-in-law perfectly. He even rode in the ambulance with me, holding my hand where the EMTs could see, asking if I was comfortable, if I needed anything. At the hospital, he brought flowers from the gift shop downstairs, cheap carnations that smelled like chemicals. The emergency room doctor examined my back and showed me the x-rays. 2 fractured vertebrae, severe spinal trauma, weeks of rehabilitation ahead if I was lucky. The doctor asked how it happened, looking between me and Luke carefully. I opened my mouth to speak, but Clara cut me off before I could form the words. He tripped on the stairs, she said quickly. He's 72. His balance isn't good. The doctor's eyes lingered on me for a moment longer, but he just nodded and wrote something on his chart. That night, after Luke and Clara left, a young nurse came to check my vitals. She adjusted my force slowly, then leaned close to my ear while pretending to check the monitor behind my bed. Her voice was barely a whisper, soft enough that only I could hear. "You didn't trip, did you?" she asked. I turned my head slightly to look at her face. She had kind eyes, the sort that had probably seen too much truth hidden behind too many lies. I didn't answer, but my silence told her everything. She squeezed my hand gently and said, "I documented everything in your chart, including the bruising pattern on your chest. Those are handprints." Then she left the room, and I stared at the ceiling, realizing I wasn't as alone as I thought. 2 days later, a man in a gray suit appeared in my hospital room, carrying a briefcase and a clipboard. He introduced himself as Marcus Tully from Midwest Home Insurance, the company that covered Luke and Clara's house. He said there'd been a claim filed for a home accident involving an elderly resident, and he needed to verify the details. His questions were careful and specific. Did I slip on anything? Were the stairs wet? Had I been drinking? I could see Luke through the small window in my door, arms crossed, watching from the hallway like a guard dog. Marcus noticed too. He asked me directly what happened, and I felt Luke's eyes burning through the glass. My throat felt tight as I forced out the words, "It was an accident." Marcus didn't write anything down. He just studied my face for a long moment, then closed his folder and said, "I see." When Marcus left, Luke came back into the room wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down heavily, leaning forward so his face was inches from mine. "Good man," he said quietly, his voice thick with satisfaction. "You keep telling that story, and we'll all get along just fine." The threat in his words was clear, even though he never raised his voice. He patted my shoulder, the same shoulder he'd grabbed when he pushed me, and stood up. Clara came in after him, holding a cup of coffee she didn't drink, staring at the floor. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her and ask when she'd become this person. But my back hurt too much to move, and my heart hurt even worse. They discharged me 2 weeks later with a back brace, a walker, and a prescription for pain medication that made me feel like I was moving through fog. Clara drove me back to their house in complete silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. My workshop, the small garage space where I'd spent 40 years building furniture and cabinets, was completely empty. Every tool, every piece of wood, every project I'd been working on had vanished. Clara helped me inside and wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked what happened. Luke came out of the kitchen drinking a beer and answered for her. "We needed the space," he said casually. "Sold most of it to cover your hospital bills." But that night, going through the mail they'd left on my dresser, I found the receipt. It wasn't for hospital payments. The receipt was for a brand new Ford F-150, purchased 3 days after my fall, registered under Luke's name. The down payment matched almost exactly what my tools would have sold for at the pawn shop, whose stamp was on the back of the slip. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at that piece of paper, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest where warmth used to be. They'd stolen from me. They'd lied for him. And they thought I was too broken, too old, too helpless to do anything about it. I folded the receipt carefully and hid it inside the lining of my wallet where no one would think to look. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Luke's hands pushing against my chest, saw Clara's face as she lied to the neighbors, to the doctors, to anyone who would listen. I wasn't as helpless as they believed. Before the accident, back when I still trusted my daughter, I kept an old flip phone hidden in the bottom drawer of my dresser for emergencies. The battery was dead, but the charger was still tucked in the back. One afternoon when Luke went to his construction site and Clara left for the grocery store, I charged that phone and made a call. Sam Pritchard answered on the second ring. We'd worked together for 20 years building custom cabinets before he started his own lumber company. I told him everything, my voice shaking with anger I'd been holding back for weeks. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then Sam said, "Walt, you might be broken right now, but you sure as hell ain't done." He promised to send help, someone I could trust. Her name was Erin Kelly, and she showed up 3 days later carrying a physical therapy bag and something else I didn't expect, a small video camera. She introduced herself to Clara and Luke as my in-home rehabilitation specialist, hired through my insurance to help me regain mobility. Luke didn't like it immediately. I could see the suspicion in his eyes as Erin set up her equipment in the living room. She explained brightly that she recorded all her sessions for documentation purposes, to track patient progress and protect against liability. It was standard procedure, she said, completely routine. Luke's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue without looking suspicious. That first session, Erin was gentle but thorough, moving my legs through exercises that hurt like fire. Every grimace, every painful stretch, every bruise still visible on my skin, the camera caught it all. When Luke tried to hover nearby, Erin politely asked him to give us space. He left the room, but I could feel him listening from the hallway. After the third session, when Luke was outside working on his new truck, Erin leaned close while adjusting my back brace. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We're building your case, Mr. Dean," she said. "Every session, every injury, every piece of evidence gets documented and backed up to a secure server. When you're ready to tell the truth, you'll have proof." I looked at her face, this stranger who was risking her professional reputation to help me, and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. She saw it in my eyes and smiled slightly. "Sam told me what really happened," she continued, "and I've seen enough abuse cases to know the signs. Those bruises on your chest are handprints. The fracture pattern in your spine is consistent with impact, not a fall. When the time comes, this evidence will speak for itself." Clara came into my room one morning before dawn. I woke to find her sitting in the chair beside my bed, crying silently in the dark. When she realized I was awake, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Her voice broke on the last word. I asked her the question that had been burning in my chest since the moment I hit those stairs. "Then tell the truth, Clara. Tell them what Luke did." She went completely still, and even in the darkness I could see the fear cross her face. "You don't understand," she said, her voice small and broken. "If I tell the truth, he'll leave me. Or worse." She stood up quickly and left the room before I could respond. Later that night, I heard Luke on the phone in the kitchen, his voice low but clear through the thin walls. My name came up, followed by the words insurance claim and settlement. I closed my eyes and knew this was bigger than I'd realized. The next morning, while searching for stamps in the desk drawer Clara told me to use, Aaron found a document that made both of us go cold. It was an insurance policy I'd never seen before, never signed. But there at the bottom was my signature, or something that looked close enough to pass. The policy designated Luke as the primary beneficiary in the event of elder injury or accidental death occurring on insured property. He'd insured me like a piece of property, and according to the filing date, he'd done it 2 months before he pushed me down those stairs. Erin's hands shook as she held the paper up to the light. "This is premeditated," she whispered. "He planned this." She pulled out her phone and photographed the document from every angle, making sure the forged signature and policy details were crystal clear. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and determination. "This is enough to sink him, Mr. Dean. If you're ready." I told her I was ready, but I wanted to wait for the right moment. Erin agreed and uploaded everything to a secure cloud account Sam had set up, organizing the files with dates and descriptions. 2 days later, someone knocked on the front door. Luke answered, and I heard a man's voice asking to speak with Walter Dean. My heart started pounding as Luke led a detective into the living room where I sat in my recliner. The detective introduced himself as Raymond Cross from the county sheriff's department. Apparently, the hospital nurse who'd whispered to me that first night had filed a quiet report about suspected elder abuse. Detective Cross asked Luke and Clara to sit down, then turned his attention to me. His questions were sharp and specific. He asked about the night of the fall, about my relationship with Luke, about whether anyone had threatened me. Luke sat on the couch, smiling like this was all a misunderstanding, playing the helpful family member perfectly. But when Detective Cross asked me directly if anyone had pushed me down those stairs, I looked at Luke and saw real fear in his eyes for the first time. I opened my mouth to answer, and Clara grabbed my hand hard enough to hurt. "Dad gets confused sometimes," she said quickly, her voice too bright, too desperate. "The medication makes him say things that don't make sense." Detective Cross looked at her, then at me, then at her hand squeezing mine. He didn't write anything down, just watched us all carefully. "Mr. Dean," he said slowly, "if you're being threatened, or if you're afraid to speak freely, you can tell me. I can protect you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Luke's smile had frozen on his face, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. Clara's fingernails dug into my palm. For a moment, I almost told him everything. But then I remembered the camera in the therapy room, the documents Aaron had photographed, the case we were building. I needed more time. So I said, "I fell? Just like they told you." Detective Cross studied my face for a long moment, then stood up and handed me his card. "If you remember anything different, call me." After he left, Clara collapsed onto the couch crying. But I noticed Luke watching me with cold calculation in his eyes. That night, Luke found the camera. Aaron had hidden it behind the curtain near where we did therapy sessions, positioned to capture the whole room. I was lying in bed when I heard the crash, the sound of plastic and glass hitting the hardwood floor, followed by Luke's voice roaring my name. He stormed into my room holding the broken camera, his face purple with rage. "You think you're smart, old man?" he shouted, throwing the pieces onto my bed. "You think you can spy on me in my own house?" Clara appeared in the doorway, pale and shaking, but she didn't say anything. Luke leaned over me, and I could smell beer on his breath. "Tomorrow morning, you're out of here," he said. "I don't care if you can barely walk. You're done disrespecting this family." I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly and said, "I'll go." What Luke didn't know was that Aaron had backed up every video file to Sam's cloud storage the same day she recorded them. The camera he destroyed was just an empty shell. The real evidence was safe, and there was nothing he could do about it. Sam picked me up at dawn in his old pickup truck. Luke watched from the porch, arms crossed, making sure I actually left. Clara stood behind him, crying, but she didn't come down to say goodbye. Sam loaded my single suitcase and helped me into the passenger seat, supporting my weight as my back screamed in protest. We drove in silence for 20 minutes until the house disappeared behind us. Then Sam pulled into a roadside motel, the kind with flickering neon signs and weekly rates. He'd already paid for a room. Inside, the space was small but clean, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without someone watching my every move. Sam set a laptop on the small table and opened a folder labeled Dean Case. Inside were organized subfolders: medical records, video evidence, financial documents, witness statements. "We're going to make this right, Walt," he said quietly. I looked at the screen and saw two names I didn't recognize listed under contacts. One was a local reporter named Angela Moore. The other was a state prosecutor. Angela Moore arrived at the motel 3 days later carrying a voice recorder and a notepad. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She sat across from me at the small table and said, "Tell me everything, Mr. Dean. Start from the beginning." So I did. I told her about Luke's temper, about the years of watching him tear Clara down, about the night he pushed me, about Clara's lies to protect him. I showed her the forged insurance document, the receipts from the truck purchase, the hospital records with the nurse's notes about handprint bruises. She listened without interrupting, occasionally writing something down, but mostly just letting me talk. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Dean, I've been investigating Luke Brennan for 6 months. He's filed similar injury claims through his construction company before, using different family members and employees. You're not the first victim, but you might be the one who finally brings him down." Angela explained that Luke's construction company had a pattern. Accidents that seemed random at first, but when you looked closer, the timing was always perfect. Someone would get hurt right before a major expense came due, right before a loan payment, right before a business deal needed funding. The insurance money would flow in, and somehow Luke always came out ahead. But he'd been careful. No one could prove the accidents weren't genuine until now. "The difference with you," Angela said, "is the evidence. The video documentation, the medical records with that nurse's observations, the forged insurance policy. It's all circumstantial alone, but together it tells a clear story." She wanted to publish an article, she said, but she needed one more thing to make it irrefutable. She needed Luke to confess, or at least say enough on record that his intentions became clear. I asked how we'd get that, and she smiled. "That's where Sam comes in." Sam called Luke 2 days later and said he wanted to discuss a settlement. He told Luke that I was willing to drop any potential complaints in exchange for medical expenses and a small amount to cover the lost tools. Luke jumped at the offer, probably thinking he'd won, that the old man had finally given up. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. What Luke didn't know was that Sam had a recording device in his jacket pocket, voice-activated and crystal clear. I stayed at the motel, listening to a live feed through Sam's phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give out. Luke showed up 15 minutes late, confident and smiling. I heard him order coffee, heard the scrape of chair legs, heard his voice turn smooth and condescending as he said, "So the old man finally sees reason." Sam played his part perfectly, sounding defeated and tired, asking Luke to explain what happened that night so they could settle everything cleanly. And Luke, arrogant and sure he'd gotten away with it, started talking. "Look," Luke said through the recording, his voice clear and unmistakable. "Walter was a problem. He stuck his nose where it didn't belong, lecturing me about how I treat my own wife. Someone needed to teach him his place." Sam pressed gently, asking if that's why the fall happened. Luke laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Fall makes it sound like an accident. I gave him a push, sure, but the old man was already broken. I just made it official. And honestly, the insurance payout made the whole thing worth the hassle." The words hung in the air like a confession written in stone. Sam kept him talking for another 10 minutes, getting details about the forged insurance document, about how he'd planned it weeks in advance, about how Clara didn't know until after but agreed to lie because she was scared. Every word was recorded, time-stamped, and legally admissible. When the meeting ended, Sam came straight back to the motel and played the recording again. We sat there in silence, listening to Luke destroy himself with his own arrogance. 2 weeks later, the Ohio Chronicle published Angela's article on the front page of the local section. The headline read, "Local contractor exploits father-in-law for insurance fraud. Pattern of abuse exposed." The story included everything: photographs of the forged insurance document, screenshots from Aaron's therapy videos showing my injuries, excerpts from the hospital records with the nurse's observations about handprint bruising, and most damning of all, selected quotes from Luke's recorded confession. By noon, Luke's construction company website was flooded with angry comments. By evening, his business phone was disconnected. By the next morning, the county prosecutor's office issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of insurance fraud, elder abuse, and assault. I sat in that motel room watching the news coverage on Sam's laptop, feeling something I hadn't felt in months: vindication. But there was still one piece missing. Clara hadn't answered any of my calls. No one knew where she'd gone. When the police arrested Luke at his house, Clara wasn't there. Neighbors reported seeing her leave 2 days earlier with suitcases loaded in her car, driving away alone. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't leave a forwarding address. I drove back to the house with Sam the day after Luke's arrest, using the spare key I still had. The place was almost empty. Furniture gone, drawers ransacked, closets stripped bare. Walking through those hollow rooms felt like moving through a tomb. Everything I'd helped them build, everything I'd sacrificed for, had been packed up and hauled away like it never mattered. But on the kitchen counter, anchored under a coffee mug, Clara left me a note. The handwriting was shaky, the paper wrinkled like she'd cried while writing it. "I'm sorry, Dad," it said. "I couldn't face you. I'm so ashamed of what I let happen, of who I became. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I never stopped loving you." Beneath the note was a check, uncashed, for the full amount of the insurance payout Luke had received. The trial happened faster than I expected. Luke's lawyer tried to argue that the recording was entrapment, that the insurance document was a misunderstanding, that my injuries could have come from the fall itself. But the jury didn't buy it. The prosecution played Aaron's videos, showing the handprint bruises on my chest, the careful documentation of my injuries. They called the hospital nurse who'd first suspected abuse. They brought in an expert who testified that my spinal fractures were consistent with impact from behind, not from falling forward. And then they played the recording of Luke's confession, his voice filling the courtroom as he described pushing me, planning the fraud, calling me broken. I watched his face while his own words condemned him. The smirk he'd worn through most of the trial finally disappeared. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they came back, the verdict was guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison for fraud and assault. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Luke turned and looked directly at me. His voice was quiet but venomous. "She'll never come back to you." Luke was wrong. 3 months after the trial, a letter appeared under my motel room door. I recognized Clara's handwriting immediately. My hands shook as I opened it. She wrote that she'd been living in Pennsylvania with a friend from college, too ashamed to contact me, too broken to know what to say. She'd read Angela's article. She'd followed the trial online. She'd realized, finally, how blind she'd been, how completely Luke had manipulated her, how much she'd lost trying to protect him. "You were right about everything, Dad," she wrote. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance." At the bottom of the letter was a plane ticket to Pittsburgh, dated for the following week, with my name printed on it. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, holding that ticket, feeling my chest tighten with emotions I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to tear it up and throw it away. But the other part, the part that remembered holding Clara as a baby, teaching her to ride a bike, walking her down the aisle at her wedding, that part whispered that everyone deserves a second chance. Even people who break your heart. Even daughters who lie. Because forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about deciding that love matters more than pain. I booked a cab to the airport for Tuesday morning, tucked the ticket safely in my wallet, and for the first time since that terrible night on the stairs, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, my family wasn't completely lost after all. The man who fell down those stairs died that night. The man sitting in this motel room, holding a plane ticket to a second chance, had finally learned to stand again.